The forest was alive with whispers, not of wind or leaves, but of fear. 4 children, no older than 12, crouched beneath a tangle of roots, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide with the kind of terror that only comes from being hunted. The galaxy was vast, its stars countless, but for these 4, there was no corner distant enough to hide them. Their names, Lyra, Kale, Terran, and Little Mira, were scrawled on bounty boards across a dozen systems, each head priced at millions of credits. The hunters were coming, and the children knew it. Lyra, the eldest at 12, clutched a jagged piece of metal she'd scavenged from a crashed skiff. Her dark hair was matted with dirt, her face streaked with the grime of days spent running. She'd taken charge of the group, not because she wanted to, but because someone had to. Kale, 11, sat beside her, his knees pulled tight to his chest, his sharp green eyes scanning the shadows. Terran, 10, was trying to keep Mira, barely 7, quiet, pressing a hand gently over her sister's mouth as she whimpered. They were siblings, not by blood but by circumstance, bound together by a shared secret that made them targets. The galaxy called them the Starborn, though they didn't know why. Whispers of their existence had spread like a virus, tales of children who could bend the fabric of reality, who could make stars flicker with a thought or turn a man's mind to ash. The stories were exaggerated, as stories often are, but there was truth at their core. The children didn't fully understand their abilities, only that they were different, and that difference had painted a target on their backs. It had started a year ago, in a mining colony on the edge of the Orion Spur. Lyra had been scavenging for scraps when she'd accidentally set a pile of ore ablaze with a flick of her hand. She hadn't meant to, it just happened, like a reflex. The flames had danced blue and unnatural, and the miners had stared, not in awe but in fear. Word spread fast, too fast. By the time the children realized they were being watched, the first hunters had arrived, mercenaries with sleek ships and cold eyes, hired by faceless powers who wanted the Starborn's abilities for themselves. The children fled, hopping freighters and hiding in the underbellies of spaceports. They learned quickly how to survive, how to steal food without being seen, how to sleep with one eye open. But the galaxy was shrinking around them. Every port, every station, every backwater moon seemed to have eyes watching, waiting. The bounty had grown with each sighting, ballooning to sums that could buy entire planets. And the hunters weren't just mercenaries now, corporations, governments, even rogue ice had joined the chase, each wanting a piece of the children's power. Tonight, they were hiding on Virtus, a jungle planet so dense with life it was said to swallow whole ships. The canopy above was a labyrinth of vines and glowing fungi, the air thick with the hum of insects and the distant roars of predators. The children had found a hollow beneath a massive tree, its roots forming a natural cage around them. It was as safe a place as any, but safety was an illusion when the galaxy wanted you dead. "Don't leave us, human," Mira whispered, her voice barely audible. She clung to Terran, her small hands trembling. The words weren't directed at anyone specific, just a plea to the universe, to anyone who might listen. Lyra tightened her grip on the metal shard, her knuckles white. She wanted to tell Mira it would be okay, but lies felt heavy on her tongue. Kale shifted, his eyes catching a glint of light through the roots. "They're close," he said, his voice low. He had a knack for sensing things, hunters, danger, even the faint hum of a ship's engine miles away. It was part of what made him Starborn, though he hated the term. To him, it was a curse, not a gift. "How many?" Lyra asked, keeping her voice steady. 3, maybe 4. Drones, 2, small ones, scanning the canopy. Lyra cursed under her breath. Drones were bad news, silent, relentless, and equipped with tech that could pick up a heartbeat through solid rock. They'd outrun drones before, but it was never easy. "We need to move," she said, glancing at the others. Before they tightened the net. Terran shook his head, his face pale. "Myra's too tired. She won't make it far." "I can run," Mira protested, but her voice was weak, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She'd been sick for days, a fever burning through her small frame. Whatever power she had, and Lyra had seen her make flowers bloom from barren soil, it wasn't helping her now. "We'll carry her," Lyra said, her tone final. "We don't have a choice." They crawled out from under the roots, moving as silently as they could. The jungle was a maze, but Lyra had a knack for navigation, another piece of the puzzle that made them Starborn. She led them through narrow paths, avoiding the glowing pools of sap that could burn through skin. Kale stayed at the rear, his senses sharp, while Terran carried Mira on his back, her arms draped loosely around his neck. The hunters were professionals, not the clumsy bounty chasers they'd evaded in the early days. These were Apex Syndicate, a guild of killers who operated like a machine, efficient, coordinated, and utterly without mercy. Their ships had been spotted orbiting Virtus 2 days ago, sleek black triangles that blotted out the stars. The children had hoped the jungle would hide them, but hope was a fragile thing. A faint hum broke the silence, and Kale froze. "Drone," he whispered, pointing upward. Lyra followed his gaze, spotting a faint red light weaving through the trees. It was small, no bigger than a fist, but its sensors could map the entire area in seconds. She gestured for the others to get down, and they pressed themselves into the mud, barely breathing. The drone hovered closer, its light sweeping the ground. Lyra felt a tug in her chest, like a thread being pulled. It was her power, stirring unbidden. She clenched her fists, trying to keep it in check. The last time she'd let it loose, she'd leveled a warehouse, and the memory of the screams still haunted her. But the drone was too close, its light grazing the edge of Terran's boot. Mira whimpered, and the drone's light snapped toward the sound. Lyra acted on instinct, thrusting her hand forward. The air shimmered, and the drone sparked, its circuits frying as it plummeted to the ground. The noise was louder than she'd hoped, a sharp crack that echoed through the jungle. "Move," Lyra hissed, pulling Mira from Terran's back. They ran, weaving through the trees, branches clawing at their skin. Behind them, the hum of more drones filled the air, joined by the distant thud of boots. The hunters were closing in. They reached a clearing where the jungle thinned, revealing a river that cut through the landscape like a blade. The water was black under the starlight, its surface rippling with unseen currents. Lyra hesitated. Crossing it would expose them, but staying in the jungle meant being cornered. "We swim," she said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. Kale shook his head. "The current's too strong. We'll drown. We'll die if we stay," Lyra snapped. She waded into the water, testing its pull. It was cold, strong, but not impossible. She turned to the others, her eyes fierce. "We can do this. Together." Terran nodded, hoisting Mira onto his shoulders. Kale hesitated, then followed, his face grim. The water was up to their waists when the first shot rang out, a pulse of energy that scorched the air above their heads. Lyra spun, spotting 3 figures emerging from the trees, hunters in black armor, their visors glowing red. Drones buzzed around them like wasps, their lights locking onto the children. "Keep going," Lyra shouted, pushing Terran and Mira ahead. She turned to face the hunters, her power surging despite her efforts to control it. The air around her crackled, and the ground trembled. One of the hunters raised a rifle, but before he could fire, the earth beneath him split, swallowing him up to his knees. He screamed, struggling to free himself. Kale grabbed her arm. "Lyra, stop, you'll bring the whole jungle down." She yanked free, her eyes wild. "I'm not letting them take us." Another hunter fired, the shot grazing Kale's shoulder. He staggered but didn't fall, his face twisting in pain. Mira screamed, and the air around her shimmered, a faint glow emanating from her small body. The river surged, a wave rising unnaturally to crash against the hunters, knocking one into the water. The drones faltered, their circuits shorting out in the sudden flood. "Run," Lyra yelled, pulling Kale toward the far bank. They stumbled through the water, the current dragging at their legs. Terran reached the other side first, setting Mira down before turning to help Lyra and Kale. The remaining hunters were regrouping, their shouts carrying over the roar of the river. More drones appeared, their lights cutting through the darkness. The children scrambled up the bank, collapsing into the mud. Lyra's chest heaved, her power still buzzing under her skin. She looked at the others, Mira pale and shivering, Kale clutching his bleeding shoulder, Terran's face set with grim determination. They were alive, but for how long? "We can't keep running," Terran said, his voice hoarse. "They'll find us. They always do." Lyra didn't answer. She knew he was right. The galaxy was too big, too connected. There was no place to hide, not forever. But giving up wasn't an option. She thought of the stories they'd heard, of labs and cages where Starborn were dissected, their powers harvested like crops. She'd rather die than let that happen to them. "We need a ship," Kale said, wincing as he pressed a hand to his wound. "Something fast. We get off this planet, we can lose them in the void." "And go where?" Terran asked. "Every port's got our faces plastered on screens." "There's the outer rim," Lyra said, her voice quiet. "The uncharted systems. No one goes there, not even the Syndicate." Kale snorted. "Because it's a death trap. Radiation, black holes, rogue drones. You name it. Better than here," Lyra said. She looked at Mira, who was curled up against Terran, her eyes half closed. We don't have a choice. They moved again, slower this time, sticking to the shadows of the jungle. Kale's wound was worse than he let on, his steps faltering. Lyra tore a strip from her shirt to bind it, but the blood kept seeping through. Myra's fever hadn't broken, and Terran was struggling to keep her awake. The hunters weren't far behind, the hum of drones was a constant reminder. By dawn, they reached the edge of a derelict spaceport, its landing pads cracked and overgrown with vines. A single ship sat in the center, a rusted freighter that looked like it hadn't flown in years. Lyra's heart sank, but it was their only chance. Can you get it running? She asked Kale, who had a knack for machines, another starborn quirk. He studied the ship, his face pale. Maybe, if it's not completely fried. They broke into the ship, the hatch groaning as it opened. The interior smelled of mildew and oil, but the controls were intact. Kale set to work, his hands moving with a speed that belied his injury. Lyra stood guard, her eyes on the jungle, while Terran tried to make Mira comfortable. Minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The hum of drones grew louder, and Lyra spotted movement in the trees, hunters, closing in. Kale, we're out of time, she said, her voice tight. Almost there, he muttered, sparking wires together. The ship's engine sputtered, then roared to life, shaking the hull. Lyra let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The hunters broke into the clearing, weapons raised. Lyra didn't think. She unleashed her power, the air around the ship warping as she created a barrier of raw energy. Shots ricocheted off it, but she could feel the strain, like a muscle tearing. Get us up, she shouted. Kale slammed the controls, and the ship lurched skyward, the jungle falling away below. The hunters fired, but the shots couldn't penetrate Lyra's shield. The ship broke through the atmosphere, the stars stretching out before them. For a moment, they were free. But freedom was fleeting. The ship was old, its systems failing. Alarms blared as they entered the void, warning of leaks and power surges. Kale fought to keep it stable, but his strength was fading. Myra's fever was worse, her small body shaking with each breath. Terran held her close, whispering words of comfort that felt empty. Lyra stared out the viewport, the stars blurring as her eyes filled with tears. Don't leave us, human, Mira had said, and the words echoed in her mind. She didn't know if they could outrun the hunters, or if the outer rim would be their salvation or their grave. But she knew one thing, they'd fight. For each other, for the chance to live, for the hope that somewhere in the vast, cold galaxy, there was a place for them. The ship limped toward the unknown, carrying 4 children who were more than human, but still so very small. The hunters would come